decided that we should sail for Italy. They proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. And the next day, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and received care. And from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia, and there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. And when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it we came to a certain place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. And when considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them, and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be attended with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And when a moderate south wind came up, supposing they had gained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before long there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Eurykeel, and when the ship was caught in it, it could not face the wind. We gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. And running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. And after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis. They let down the sea anchor, and so let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. And when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in the midst and said, Men, you ought to have followed my advice, and not to have set sail from Crete, and incurred this damage and loss. And yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there shall be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God, and it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. But when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. And they took sounding and found it to be 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took another sounding, found it to be 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. As the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. And until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them to take some food, saying, Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you shall perish. And having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all. And he broke it and began to eat. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. And all of us in the ship were 276 persons. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. And when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a certain bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. and hoisting the foresail to the wind, they were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves, and the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, that none of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And thus it happened that they were brought safely to land. They enter this storm, and then the next day, and the day after, they start throwing cargo overboard. So they go into emergency mode to take the ropes, gird up the ship, and now they're actually throwing stuff overboard. If somebody who wasn't familiar with riding on a ship in the Mediterranean, that would probably get your attention. I think you maybe just right there, trying to manage your tea that you're drinking or something like that because of the top. And then you start to see the sailors take stuff and throw overboard, and you think, okay, this is just not your normal passage in the Mediterranean. This is something a little bit more serious. No sun, no stars, no control, no way to navigate, and no hope. And those on board slowly gave up. And then Paul stands up, and he says this. You should have listened to me. I don't know, has anybody ever gotten those words before? It's either been I told you so, or it's been, you know what you should have done. I remember we're with family members, we get together for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and it usually involves getting together and playing a game. And we have this game we play, it's called Catchphrase. And it's what you have to do is you have to describe the word without actually saying the word. And it's so funny because we can be the best critics, towards the other person, and that's exactly what this individual was being to me. I was struggling, trying to describe this, nobody was getting it, and as soon as it ended, it out came, you know what you should have done. And I'm like, well, that's really useful information now, thank you very much, but that's not helping me at all. And I don't know if Paul was saying it in a smugness. I'm sure there was probably some fear going on with Paul too, but here he stands up, and it's true. I mean, they should have listened to Paul. If they would have just stayed where they were at, let this pass, they would have been fine. But they didn't. And, I don't think he says this in desperation. I don't think he stands up and says, you idiots, if you would have just listened to me, now we're all going to die. It doesn't go into that. So I'm not, this is where when you're reading it, you're kind of failed because you don't know what the expression is on Paul's face. You don't know exactly how he's saying it. But he says it, hey, you should have listened to me. And I think he says it in hope, because what he says after that kind of helps. I mean, and it's, hey, you know what? Yeah, you should have followed my advice. But you know what? Verse 22, keep up your courage. And you're thinking, you've got to be nuts. What is there to have courage about? I mean, they were just throwing everything overboard. They don't know where they're going. The wind is actually driving them along now instead of the captain. And so Paul says, hey, keep up your courage. What? Don't you see what's happening out there? We're all going to die. And Paul says, we will lose the ship, but we won't lose our lives. Now, if you just stop to think about that for a moment, knowing that you're going to have to go through some sort of experience like this to lose the ship, you're looking at the ship, as large as it is, and you think, I'm going to escape with my life, but what I'm standing on right now is not going to make it. And so your thought process goes forward into the future to think, this is going to be pretty horrendous. I'm going to survive this? And he goes on to say, you know what? An angel of God whom I've served stood before me and said, don't be afraid. You will live, and those who are with you will live, because, hey, you still need to go to Rome, Paul. I'm not leaving you. I didn't bring you out here on this ship so you could die. And so Paul encourages them, let's keep up our courage. Because you know what? I believe God. I believe what he said. It's one thing to believe God while sitting on the beach watching the sunset, kind of enjoying a nice thing of pineapple. It's quite another to be on a ship in the middle of a violent storm with no control, with fading hope, and say, I believe what God says. I think Paul has demonstrated time and time again that he was a man of action, and that things that he said he would do. But at the same time, when you think about it, when you're on this ship that you really don't have any control over whatsoever, all you're really doing is hoping that it doesn't break apart, maybe believing is all you can do. And maybe that was an encouragement to them. I often wonder, how did they take that? We don't really see the expressions of their faces, all 276 of them. Hey, but you know what? If somebody came up and said, God told me this, don't worry about it. You're going to live, ship's going down, but guess what? I believe God. I would say, man, I would latch onto that hope probably faster than anything. Okay, Paul, if that's what you say, I can tell by the look on your face. You're not saying it hesitantly. Well, I think he said this. It might turn out okay. Hey, I'm going to go with you on that. So after 14 days, the sailors sensed that they were close to land, and they took soundings. It was a method to determine the distance from where they were in relationship to where they were going. And so they found out they were getting closer to land. And as they got closer, they thought they might actually run over the rocks. So they let down the anchor and the lifeboats so they can let down some more anchors. And then Paul approaches the centurion at this time and says, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. So they cut the ropes of the boat. So Paul encourages them to eat for their own good. Don't worry, you're not going to die. Paul takes some bread. Just imagine, you got the waves beating up against the ship. They have these ropes around the ship trying to keep the ship together. I'm sure they're hearing the creaking going on in the ship, wondering, is this the time that it's now going to snap and come apart? Is this the moment that now we're going to be swimming for our lives? And here Paul, he's on the ship. He takes some bread. He's giving thanks to God, even in the midst of all that. Similar to what we do if we go to a restaurant, have a meal at home. We pray before we eat. I'm just picturing Paul aboard the deck of this ship, going back and forth, giving thanks to God. And everybody just looking at him going, huh? Wow, you seem to have a whole lot of confidence in this God of yours. We broke it and ate it, and the rest were encouraged, and they ate as well. And it's at this point where it says 276 people on board. Or sometimes, as we hear it nowadays, when it comes to maybe a ship or an airliner that's in distress, 276 souls on board. I always found it so interesting that any time when it came to an emergency situation, they describe people that way. Instead of just people, it's 276 souls on board. And here is Luke, faithfully writing all these things down, all these details down. 276, Paul took the bread, he prayed, we ate, and we were encouraged. We were bouncing back and forth on the ship, not knowing what was going to happen, but we knew that we were going to be alive, and the ship was going to be lost. That's all we knew. But we didn't know exactly how this was going to take place. And so they just kept going. They just kept pressing on. So after they began to throw the cargo overboard, all the wheat, when it got light out, they could not see land, but they saw a bay with a beach. And their thought was to aim for the bay. So this is the cool part. They're not just sitting there in the ship just going, well, Paul said this, so I guess we're just going to just sit back and wait for things to happen. No, they're still doing their jobs. They're still doing what sailors do. So they thought, we're going to aim for the bay. We're going to let go of the anchors. They loosened the rudder and they lifted up the sail and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. So they headed for the beach, but they ended up hitting a reef. And the front was stuck, but the back of the ship began to break apart because of the force of the waves. So now here we have the ship that's coming apart. And it says the soldiers were planning on killing the prisoners since they feared that they would escape. And here's that centurion that God put in Paul's life. Centurion stepped in order to keep Paul safe. I mean, you can just look back. I wonder if he thinks about that too. Boy, I received more kindness from the centurions than my own people in Jerusalem. From Roman military commanders. The centurion commanded those who could swim, jump overboard, all those who couldn't, follow on whatever would bring you to shore safely. All 276 souls accounted for and safe at, if you look in chapter 28, it says Malta. If you look on a map, Malta, over 500 miles away from Crete, more than 2 weeks later, from where Paul first spoke up about sailing off into what he perceived at that time a very dangerous situation in which it was. So they were, for all of that time, drifted weeks, over 500 miles, just going about. When you look at the Mediterranean and you look at where Crete is and you look at Malta and you're talking about a ship that is out of control, it is amazing that they made it to Malta and didn't get sent somewhere else or just sent into just doing circles out in the ocean. Now, to me, this is an exciting chapter. Things that happen in this chapter still happen today. I shared a story from earlier, but, we don't have these primitive ships crossing the Mediterranean when winter is approaching. However, we do have recent instances of airliners crashing into the Atlantic Ocean or ships going down in the middle of a storm. And I know, some are fascinated with the court scene drum, but stuff like this always intrigues me. I'm always just curious. I'm reading through this whole chapter, and I'm just picturing them going along, and the different things that Luke is describing. I'm trying to put myself on that ship and see, boy, how would I be feeling? I know it would be really cold, just feeling the wind outside. And then, once you hit that storm, and looking at the expression on the captain's face and even the centurion's face when hope just seems to just drip off their face and disappear, and you think, that's it, we're done. And Paul's there and says, you know what? God spoke to me. Guess what? It's going to be all right. But stuff like this intrigues me, but it also gives me a very unsettling feeling. Why didn't the centurion listen to Paul? Why did they proceed, knowing that winter was approaching and the crossing the Mediterranean would be risky? All these questions would be asked after the fact, and they're all for the investigators. But for us, as we read this, 276 souls were so close to death. And then you have to ask the other question, why were they saved? What would have happened to them if Paul was not aboard? Like we talked about last week, the background to the background, it's God. He's the one that Paul believed. And Paul didn't keep it to himself either. He all of a sudden seemed to be the one in charge. All of a sudden, everybody's throwing stuff overboard, and Paul stands up and says, hey, don't be afraid. You're going to live. You're going to lose the ship. But I believe what God says. Eat some food. Don't be afraid. God said this, and he's going to do it. Fear can be paralyzing. I know sometimes the temptation when we go through sections of the Bible like this is how can we use the analogy to the storms in our life and all of these things that take place. And, when I was reading through that, the one thing that just kept coming up in my mind was that fear can be paralyzing. We have God's kingdom to look forward to. There's no fear when we are with God. And I can imagine how fearful it would have been out there. And I've been in situations like that as a pilot. I've flown, and it's amazing when you just see weather on TV, or you just see the person pointed out, here comes the front, and here's the rain. But I've been actually out flying into a storm, and I've turned around and returned back to the airport that I took off from, just because it was getting that scary and that violent inside that storm. And it just seems so big, and you seem so small, and you just almost seem overwhelmed by it. And you get back on the ground and your hands are shaking, and you think, well, I've done this, I've flown a million times, why? But in the event when you bring something like that to you, it's just fear. It's amazing. But in all the things that we fear, whether it's hitting an iceberg crossing the Atlantic, going down in an airliner, fearing what the dentist is going to do to your teeth, if the anesthesia is not going to work or not, fearing what the doctor's going to say after some tests are done, fear about trying to figure out if a loved one made it safely home or made it safely to where they were going, especially with Thanksgiving coming up. But it's good to remind ourselves, though, like in Isaiah 41:10, end with this verse. Isaiah 41:10. Do not fear, I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. We are all going to face that moment where it's going to be our last breath. But just like when Paul was in Caesarea, wondering if he's ever going to get out of there, the people that he was that he loved, his Jewish brothers and sisters, trying to convince him that Jesus is the way, and they just weren't listening. And Jesus comes by his side. I'm with you, Paul. And there's Paul out on the ship, and Paul has that moment with God out there. Paul. Didn't say it, but he was with Paul. And I'm sure that Paul, we recognize the fact that he was a great apostle, but at the same time, he was a human being. And I'm sure of it. I'm sure there was probably some moments where he's standing on that deck going, oh, this is really overwhelming. And then God came to him. So when we're overwhelmed with fear, in whatever form it comes, from the smallest to the largest, let's always go back to God. Let's go back to what His Word says. Yeah, tomorrow may be our last day, or maybe years from now. Because do not fear, I am with you. And that's the great thing to remember, because you know what? Where we are pointing is His kingdom. To be with Him in completeness. But yet, even when we're here on earth, He is still with us. And fear cannot overcome that. Only God can overcome that fear. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your words. I just think about, boy, that just must have been an amazing few months that Paul was out there. And they didn't, even through that chapter, they're not even at Italy yet. They're on this island that they had struggled along for so long and barely made it. But Lord, you knew they would. And sometimes we can get caught up in asking the questions of why this, why now, why them, why me. Lord, when our time comes, our time comes. For those of us that know you, it's a comfort in the fact that, yeah, facing our own mortality can be a fearful thing, but facing it without knowing you can be even more fearful. But knowing you, God, all of a sudden that fear just kind of dissipates, and knowing that you are with us. But also thinking that there's people that don't know you. Lord, that they are faced with that kind of fear. And if they don't know you, then there is no hope. And Lord, we pray that they do turn to you just like you desire. It's your desire that none of them perish. Help us to have those same desires as you, to pray for them, to talk with them. Let them know that there is no fear in you. There's love. Because if you're with us and we're with you, God, that's what we're looking forward to. In your name we pray.